Hello everyone, Adam Lafacci, your moderator, rejoining you, and we're going to be kicking off the session in just a few minutes, but before we do, we want to share a quick song with you, courtesy of Smithsonian Folkways Recordings, and you'll see the information for that song, Winning the Vote, on the screen in front of you. We hope you enjoy it, and we'll be back with you at the top of the hour.
I've been down to Madison to see the folks and sights. You'd laugh, I'm sure, to hear them talk about the women's rights. Now it's just as plain as my old hat, as plain can be, that if the women want the vote, they'll get no help from me. Not from Joe, not from Joe, if he knows it, not from Joseph, no, 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 not from Joe, not from me, I tell you, no.
Say, friend Joseph, why not we should vote as well as you? Are there no problems in this state that need our wisdom too? We must pay our taxes same as you, as citizens be true. And if some wicked thing we do, to jail we're sent by you. Yes, we are, same as you, and you know it, don't you, Joseph? Yes, you do, yet you boast you'll not help us win the vote.
But dear woman, can't you see your home is your true sphere? Just think of going to the polls, perhaps 2 times a year. You are wasting time you ought to use in sewing and at work. Your home neglected all those hours. Would you such duty shirk? Help from Joe, if he knows it, not from Joseph. No, 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 not from Joe, not from me, I tell you, no.
Joseph, tell us something new. We're tired of that old song. We'll sew the seams and cook the meals. To vote won't take us long. We will help clean house, the one too large for man to clean alone. The state and nation, don't you see, when we the vote have won? Yes, we will, and you'll help, for you'll need our help, friend Joseph. Yes, you will, when we're in, so you'd better help us win.
You're just right, how blind I've been. I ne'er had seen it thus. 'Tis true that taxes you must pay without a word or fuss. You are subject to the laws men made, and yet no word or note can you sing out where it will count. I'll help you win the vote. Yes, I will.
Thank you, Joe.
We'll together soon be voters. Yes, we will. If you'll all vote yes at the polls next fall.
And that was Winning the Vote, courtesy of Smithsonian Folkways Recordings. If you liked that song, or you're interested in checking out some of the other songs that they have available, please do check out folkways.si.edu. And with that, we are ready to start off today's session, and I would like to thank all of you for joining us for today's Smithsonian Online Education Conference, A Will of Their Own, Judith Murray and Women of Achievement in the Early Republic. If you haven't had a chance, please go over to the website after this session is complete and take a moment to introduce yourself. Or you're also welcome to introduce yourself in the chat box on the left side of the screen as we go through our session today. And that chat box on the side is the place where you can enter your content-related questions and comments throughout the session today, as well as looking for technical help if you're having any issues at your location. I'll be sure to respond to you privately to get tech questions sorted out as quickly as possible. But don't forget to reach out to us in that chat if you have questions of any type. And we have a quick poll question that we're going to launch for you now. We would love to know how many people are watching this webinar with you from your location. And you'll notice that you can click on the gray bubble that best corresponds to the number of people sitting with you. We'll be launching similar polls throughout the session today, so do keep an eye out for when we put those up. We'd love to get your feedback anytime we launch one. And I'm going to move that to the top left and leave it up for another moment. I just want to very quickly introduce myself again. I am Adam Lafacci. I'm a senior producer at Learning Times, and I am honored to be joining you all today and taking part in today's Smithsonian Online Education Conference. I will be moderating throughout, so you might hear me jump on the mic here and there, and you'll definitely see me in chat if you have any tech issues. I'm here to help. Now, if for any reason you're not able to reach out to me in the chat with a tech issue, please feel free to email us at smithsonian@learningtimes.com, and we'll have our team there to help you get signed back into the online room as quickly as possible. Though I should also note that if you miss part of the session today, or you have to leave early for any reason, we are recording it and we'll make that recording available within 1 to 2 days after the session is done. Now, there are a few ways to engage with our Smithsonian Education Conference, and the Smithsonian Quests are an excellent way to go about it. I'll be turning the floor over to Ashley Naranjo in a little bit to go a little bit more in depth into those quests. But I'd also like to touch on other ways to continue the conversation, starting with Twitter. And we are tweeting away, and you can join us in the Twitterverse at #CivilRights. Also, in many of our online education conference sessions, we have video questions submitted by students from schools around the country and around the world. And if that's something that interests you, please feel free to record a short video of a student asking a question and send that over to us. We'll share that email address with you. Oh, and I see it popping up right now from Ashley in the chat. Wonderful. So we're about to start our session for today, but before we do, I would like to just one more time mention that besides introductions on the main website, you can also join our discussion forums there. So if you have any questions today that don't get addressed during the session, please feel free to go to the forums and post them there. We're happy to continue the conversation. And I'm going to turn the floor over to Ashley Naranjo now to talk to us a little bit more about Smithsonian Quests and Smithsonian badges.
Thanks so much, Adam. Happy to be here today and happy to have Briana here from the National Portrait Gallery. Just wanted to quickly just go over some of the digital badging opportunities that we offer. These are learning extensions and challenges for students to complete. If they're interested in the content here in the online conference, they can move on to different quests and challenges and activities based on the content. And that's at smithsonianquests.org, as you see on your screen right now. And quite briefly, so on the online conference website, how you got here to the online room today, you might have noticed that there was a badge associated with this session. And so the badge for this session is called the Portrait Reader. And we use a lot of techniques from the National Portrait Gallery to start looking in a little bit deeper at some of the portraits that are highlighted within this session. In order to earn a badge, you need to complete 4 quests. And so these are smaller activities that build upon each other. So the first is to look at activists through a National Portrait Gallery website and tell the story in your own words. And then the second, the reader uses different techniques and elements of discussing portraiture and making connections to what the portrait says about that person within history. We'll also take a look at postage stamps and how those are actually examples of many portraits throughout American history. And finally, you'll make a connection to your own community in the Home Hero quest. Once you complete all 4 of these quests, you can earn a digital badge. And these digital badge submissions that students complete are actually assessed by a team of fellow Smithsonian educators and myself. So you receive feedback along the way, and we help you through the process. So if you're interested, whether you're a teacher or a student, you can learn more about that at smithsonianquest.org. Also wanted to highlight the fact that we have gathered some Smithsonian resources from online exhibitions to videos. And so when you're on the homepage, you can look for the resources tab and you'll see a variety of different ways to categorize each of the resources that we've highlighted. I'll also highlight some resources throughout the presentation, but if you have any questions, you can always go to the resources directory, or this session will be archived as well. I also wanted to mention some upcoming sessions, so you can mark your calendars. The next sessions are a two-part series called From Where I Stand, and the first will be a classroom session that will focus mainly on immigration-migration experiences and using material culture as a way to tell stories. And we'll be using the material culture of shoes, actually, and clothing to represent these stories. So it'll be really interesting. And then in the following session in May, we'll also be discussing some of the badge opportunities that are available, as well as some of the great ways, tips, and strategies to incorporate this content into the classroom. So those are April and May sessions. And then our June and July sessions, while some people might be on summer vacation, we'd love for you to check in because we have some great applications of things that students can do during the summer or in summer camps or other types of learning experiences. And so we're highlighting astrophotography, and students will hear from a scientist over at the Smithsonian Astrophysical Observatory. And we'll kind of take a look at how science and art meet, and then we'll also show you some ways that students can actually control a telescope and use images that they create to learn more about the universe. Finally, I also wanted to just highlight, Briana also presented in our inauguration conference back in January, and we highlighted the Lansdowne portrait of George Washington, which you see on your screen. And in that conference, we also had a badge at play. In the bottom right corner, you can see the symbol spotter, where students took a look at the portrait and chose one object within the portrait to make connections to their own daily life, or to see what the artist was trying to say when they did include them in the portrait. So things like the rainbow, his clothing, the quill pen, the books, and the sword all have kind of this hidden meaning behind it. And so students were able to decipher some of that meaning within this badge.
Great, and I definitely do encourage people to check out that session. I look at portraits in a totally different way since hearing Briana speak then, and I know she'll be covering some similar things today, but also in a very different context. And Briana White is joining us from the National Portrait Gallery, where I'm sure she has been seeing a lot of portraits for quite some time, and is an education specialist there. Thank you so much for joining us today.
It is absolutely my pleasure to be back. I'm happy to be here on a Wednesday afternoon with all of you talking about what we're getting ready to talk about. As you can see, I am an education specialist at the Portrait Gallery, and I manage our school and teacher programs. And so I am with teachers and students, well, a lot. And so our focus today is going to be, and you see the title on your screen, A Will of Their Own. And so I just wanted to sort of give you an overview of what we're going to be talking about today. Women have strived for rights and equality in the United States for hundreds of years. And during this session, we're going to take a look at some of the women who really have been fighting this cause from three distinct time periods in U.S. history. The first is the one I think that most people generally do not think about, and that is the late 18th century, so during the Revolutionary Era. The next is 1848 to 1920, and you'll notice, if you know your U.S. history, that those cap years are the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, and then the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920. And then the last period that we'll touch on will be the modern feminism movement of the 1970s. this session is by no means a comprehensive look at the women's rights movement in America, but really is meant to be a sampling, taking a look at specific individuals over time. So with that,
And actually, as we're about to move
yes.
on, I'd like to say it's great hearing that breakdown, because we started everyone off with a quick question in chat of how do you define the women's rights movement? And a couple of the responses that came in here, Martha in Kansas says, a drive by women to receive not only the right to vote, but the recognition that men and women should be considered equal citizens and to achieve equal pay for equal work. And Stephen adds in, Stephen from Boston, pushing for social, economic, and political change. So some nice starting points there.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think it's really important to note that often people think of women's rights and they think of just suffrage. And while that was certainly center stage for these women, there were so many other issues that they were fighting for and things that they were fighting against. And so we'll touch on these as we go through this session. And certainly feel free to ask me questions along the way as well. Okay. I do want to just take a step back before we dive right in and just give you a little bit of background about the Portrait Gallery and how we do what we do when it comes to portraits. So the Portrait Gallery is considered an art, biography, and history museum. And our mission is to tell the story of America through the people who have shaped it. And how we do this within school and teacher programs is this idea of reading portraiture. And so you'll see on your screen the elements that we must talk about if we want to read the portrait. These are the things that, that should be discussed if you want to learn about the life of the person that's being portrayed. So things like expression, hairstyle, pose and posture. Is it informal or formal? Clothing can tell us so much. Time period, status, someone's culture, setting, inside, outside. Objects, and I always like to think about objects as symbols because they're there for a reason. The medium, and this is always an important one because I think so often people think about portraits as just paintings, and that is not the case. It can be paintings and sculpture and prints and drawings, photographs, mixed media, different things like that. Size of the portrait, small or large, artistic style, can tell you about era, as well as color. When we think about color, we do think a lot about feeling and our reactions and emotions that we have when we look at an object. And just for your own reference, the sitter, the person in the portrait that's on the screen, is Mary McLeod Bethune. She was an educator, and she started Bethune-Cookman College down in Florida. So we've already touched on this briefly, but what I wanted to do was really talk about for just a second how this session came to be. And it grew out of a small exhibition that's at the National Portrait Gallery right now called A Will of Their Own, Judith, Sargent Murray, and Women of Achievement in the Early Republic. And so we have this exhibition because this portrait of Judith Sargent Murray that's on view is on loan to us from the Terra Foundation for American Art, which is based out of Chicago. It's a beautiful portrait, and I'm going to put it up on the screen in just a second. But it really sparked the curators at the Portrait Gallery to create this small exhibition. It is an exhibition of 8 women, and these are women that really they sowed the seeds for future progress. They didn't necessarily start their own women's rights movement, but they were the ones that paved the way. And so at the time of the revolution, women did not share the same status or rights as men. They couldn't vote. They couldn't hold political office. They enjoyed few property rights. They were not equal in marriage, and they had limited access to education. And so this is Judith Sargent Murray. This is a fantastic portrait by John Singleton Copley. And if you know your art history, you'll know that Copley was one of the preeminent portraitists of his day in the late 1700s. And so my first question that I want to pose to all of you is tell me what you see in this piece.
Great, and we'll give you all a moment or two to look through the portrait and see what pops out for you. But please type your thoughts into the chat box on the left side of the screen, and we'll highlight some of those answers as they come in. And Lisa points out that she sees flowers. Pam adds an elegant lady holding a basket of flowers.
Excellent. And as you're thinking about what it is that you're taking a look at, remember those elements that I had just popped up on the screen: expression, pose and posture, clothing, setting. If you look really closely, take a look at the background of this portrait. I think it's something that people don't necessarily think about when they first take a look at it.
And as you mentioned pose, I see Mary adds, her pose seems so relaxed and sure of herself.
That is an excellent observation.
Mike adds gentrified, East Coast, outdoors, touching on the location as well.
Yes, yes, absolutely. And so why do you think that a woman during this era, this portrait was painted between 1769 and 1772, why do you think that this woman, or any woman for that matter, would have their portrait painted during this era? For what purpose?
Great, and feel free to share your thoughts with us on that one in the chat as well. To our earlier question, I see Martha has just added, her dress indicates that she is possibly affluent.
I know when I look at the dress that Marie is wearing, I just have this desire to touch it because I'm pretty sure that it is made of silk. It just has that luxurious sort of feel to it.
And Stevie had even mentioned that earlier in the chat, silk dress, that
Yep.
you can see the texture.
Exactly, exactly. A mark of a good portraitist.
And speaking of marks, we have another comment here, a mark of standing within the community, why she would get her portrait.
Exactly. And so during this time, it would be someone who had a high economic status, a high social status, who would have their portrait painted.
Mm-hmm. And Mike speculates that maybe she's the wife or daughter of a successful, wealthy man.
Yes, exactly, exactly. And it is thought by curators that this portrait is actually meant to commemorate her marriage in 1769. So that very well could be the case. But Murray's story doesn't end here with this portrait. She had a lifelong interest in writing and an ambition to have her voice heard. She wrote essays. She argued that women were just as capable of intellectual accomplishment as men were, and that education would liberate women from economic dependence. She became the first woman in America, and I didn't know this before I started reading about her and this portrait. She became the first woman in America to self-publish a book. It's a 3-volume collection of writings. It's called The Gleaner. And I think that that is just amazing. And so she is the one that provides the inspiration for this very small exhibition at the Portrait Gallery. And so while we're not going to show you all of the portraits, I know that Ashley had put up a link to the exhibition earlier in the chat. So you should certainly get on the website because you can see all 8. But what we thought that we would do would be to have you choose what you wanted to focus on. And so we thought that we'd play a little game of choose your own adventure. So these three women that are on the screen, Anne Catherine Hoof Green, Phyllis Wheatley, and Abigail Adams, their portraits are all in this exhibition. And so we want to hear from you. Which one would you like to talk about next?
Great, and you'll notice that we launched another poll in the top left-hand corner of the screen. So click on the gray bubble that best corresponds to your vote, and we'll see which one we'll be going on to next. And it looks like Phyllis Wheatley is drawing the most attention and curiosity here.
Excellent.
Great, so shall we jump over and take a look at that portrait?
Yes, let's do that. This is one of my favorite portraits at the museum, and you wouldn't know it by looking at what you see on the screen, but this is actually a frontispiece for her collection of writings. And so a frontispiece is going to be the opening page of a book. So her portrait, along with everything that you see here, was found in her book. So why do you think it would be so important if Phyllis Wheatley were writing a book to have a portrait of herself in the book? I'd love to get your thoughts.
And the first thought being shared with us here in the chat, she was a slave.
Yes, and that is absolutely correct. She was a slave. She learned to read and write when she was just about 8 years old.
And Mike adds more specifically, so people knew she was African American.
Right, and that is, it's clear in the portrait that we're taking a look at. And everybody sees the objects that are sitting on the desk. We have a piece of paper, we've got the quill pen and the inkwell, and then what looks like a small book. Why are all of these items here? What do they tell us about Wheatley?
And while people are thinking about that, one of the answers that we had coming in already might connect to it. David mentions that she could write and she was literate.
Yep.
And Karen C. adds she was educated to show her intellect and that she is educated. That's Martha in Kansas.
Exactly. And it was, besides all of those things, it was proof for those people that were purchasing the book that Wheatley herself wrote it, because people did believe that she didn't write the book, but in fact she did. And so you see also around the portrait itself in the oval, it says Phyllis Wheatley, Negro servant to Mr. John Wheatley of Boston. And so this was her owner. And then at the bottom, you see that it was published according to an act of Parliament, September 1st, 1773. And so the book itself, it looks like was not published in the United States, but was published in England. It's interesting because we don't know who created this portrait. There was, our curators believe for quite some time that they actually, knew who the artist was, but then things come up and research happens and they realize that, again, it's a mystery. It is wonderful, though, to see the book itself, and that is what's on view at the Portrait Gallery with the page opened to this particular image of Phyllis Wheatley. So with that, we're going to move on, to Margaret Todd Wetton. And I stop here because I think that this portrait is so fascinating because of the medium that was used to create it. I want everybody to take a close look and take a wild guess what was used to create this portrait. Yes, Pam, you're right. It is wax. And then on top of the wax, it is oil paint. So when you look at this piece, it is actually a relief. It is raised. And I find it so fascinating because this is not the type of medium that you would see very often during this era in history. Really, this era was all about oil paintings. Margaret is a really interesting character because she lived in New York when the British occupied it during the Revolution, and her home was dubbed Rebel Headquarters. And it was because people who were part of the American cause would go there for supplies and such, and to be housed. And after the war, George Washington sent a letter of gratitude to Margaret for her service during the Revolution.
And just a couple of questions regarding this piece.
Sure.
Martha is just asking for clarification. So it is 3D?
Yes, it is 3D, which again, absolutely fascinating. If you could see me, you would see that I have a big smile on my face because, I mean, it really is neat to take a close look and think about how difficult and how skilled the artist must have been to create this portrait.
And another question about it being made of wax. What prevents it from melting in the heat of the summer?
If only I knew. It would never have gone. Well, I can tell you now that it doesn't go out in the heat of the summer. The portrait gallery, when it's on view and when it's in storage, it's in a climate-controlled space. So I can't answer how it stayed intact for all the years before it came to the portrait gallery, but I can answer how it stays intact now.
A lot of careful preservation now.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. So with that, what I'd like to do is jump us ahead once again. And so in 1848, you all know that Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, they came together and they did the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848. And so this really was that moment in U.S. history that we look back on now as the beginning of the really formal women's rights movement. And so we offer up another Choose Your Own Adventure. On the screen, you have Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, Belva Ann Lockwood, and Lucretia Mott. And so who do you want to hear about?
And it's a tricky one. It looks like Susan B. Anthony and Belva Ann Lockwood are neck and neck here with the votes. We'll just give it another moment so everyone can have a chance to cast their vote on where we'll go next. And it looks like Belva Ann Lockwood is our participant's choice today, so we'll jump over to that portrait now.
Excellent. Good choice, everyone. She is also one of my favorites. This portrait is huge. It is, gosh, I guess it must be just about 7 feet tall, and it is an oil painting on canvas. And I love the fact that it was painted by a woman. Belva Ann Lockwood, lived during the turn of the century, so during the Gilded Age. And this portrait was created by Nellie Mathis Horn in 1913. And so before I tell you a little bit about her, let's see what we can glean from what we see. So describe her clothing and what it might say about her.
Great. So with special attention to the clothing right now, please let us know in the chat box what your thoughts are. I see Lisa from Illinois jumping in here, possibly a minister, degree in hand and wearing a graduate robe, a judge, question mark. Pam says academic. Martha adds wealthy. It looks like she has a fur on.
It does almost look like it's a fur, doesn't it? She is receiving in this portrait, it's to commemorate an honorary degree that she received from her alma mater, which was Syracuse University, and it was presented to her, this honorary degree, in 1908. So it was academic. She is wearing a robe. And I think that it is interesting that somebody thought that perhaps she looked like a judge here, because while Belva Ann Lockwood certainly believed in suffrage as a way to gain women's rights, her passion, her focus was on education for women. And so she became the first woman to be admitted to speak, to argue before the Supreme Court. And so she has a really rich history. When she was younger, she was denied the right to teach physical education to female pupils. So she protested until that privilege was granted to her. She got her law degree. And all she wanted to do is to be able to argue before the Supreme Court. And it took a while, but finally she was able to do it. So she also knew that she couldn't vote, but she could technically run for public office. And she became the first woman to formally declare her candidacy for president, which I think is just great and fascinating. And when you look at this portrait, you see this woman dressed in this way, getting this degree. But I look at her expression and I think she's proud. I mean, she is proud of all that she's accomplished. And she knows that there are some good things on the horizon. So with that, we're going to move on to Sojourner Truth. And I wanted to stop at Truth because of the quote that's at the bottom of this small carte de visite. Cartes de visite were really popular during this era in history. They came after the first form of photography, daguerreotypes, and cartes de visite were small visiting cards or calling cards. They were really tiny. I would say 3.5 inches tall by 2.5 inches wide. And people would go to a photography studio and then they would have these cartes de visite mass produced, and they would either give them to people or they would sell them. And so here we have this portrait of Truth. And it's great. You see that she's in a studio. She's sitting in this really lovely chair. She has these tassels behind her. And she's, it looks as if she is crocheting. And so I want you to all take a look at that quote. I sell the shadow to support the substance. And when you think about Sojourner Truth's contribution to American history, and knowing that she lectured around the country, not only about abolition, but also about women's rights, what do you think it means? Why do you think that she says at the bottom of this carte de visite, I sell the shadow to support the substance?
That's a great question. So what do you make of the meaning of the quote at the bottom of this card? And feel free to let us know in the chat box. And our first response in here, the shadow is the photo, the substance is her cause for liberation.
Absolutely. And I always think what a wonderful conversation to have with students because we so we don't very often have portraits that have words on them. I can think of just a few cases in the collection of the museum. And so this quotation really does give us all we need to know about learning about Sojourner Truth. And yes, she is the shadow. Her portrait is the shadow, and the substance is her work. So she sold her portrait in order to be able to go out on the lecture circuit and talk about abolition and to talk about women's rights. Smart woman to be able to do that. I think that it's absolutely fascinating. Cartes de visite, just as a small aside, cartes de visite were so popular during this era that the government excised a tax on them. And so oftentimes when you see a carte de visite from this era, if you flip it over, you'll see a 1 or 2 cent tax stamp on it. And people can still purchase them today. You just have to know where to look. They were so popular that people had albums of these cartes de visite. The Portrait Gallery has an incredibly rich collection of cartes de visite. So with that, we are going to end our 1848 to 1920 time frame with Carrie Chapman Catt. And this portrait was created in 1927, also by a woman. And so the significance of 1927 is that the portrait was created after the 19th Amendment was passed in 1920. And I stop at Catt because she was, at the time of the passage of the 19th Amendment, she was the president of the National American Women's Suffrage Association. Now, that organization had taken on or had been other things before it was the National American Women's Suffrage Association. And prior to Catt, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and not Sojourner Truth, but Susan B. Anthony were also presidents of that particular organization. But it was Catt who was its president in 1920. And so I want to skip ahead now to 1970. And I think that it's a really nice connection to make because when we think about the modern feminism movement, 1970 is certainly a banner year because what happened in 1970?
And our first couple responses that popped in here, Right for Women to Vote, and the marches, now end the marches, Title IX.
Right, right. And so it was an anniversary. So not only was it really the beginning of this modern movement, but it was the 50th anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment. And I saw a comment in here as well about what is the 19th Amendment. And that amendment gave women in the United States the right to vote. And so in 1970, women started fighting for more. And I stop at this photograph because I want you to take a look at everything that's going on around the sitter, Kate Millett. Can you tell based on what you see where she is and or what it is that she's doing?
I see it's a march of women protesting in a big city, either NYC or San Francisco, maybe. New York rally against magazine.
Okay.
She seems very happy.
She does seem very happy. And so it is New York, and it is a march. It's not necessarily a protest. Really, what it was a march to commemorate, again, the passage of the 19th Amendment. And that march ended at Bryant Park in the city. And during the rally, Millett spoke. And she said to the crowd, "Today is the end of millenniums of oppression." Kate Millett winds up being a figure during this movement that takes on a pretty prominent role. And it was because of her thesis that she wrote. She didn't think that it would have the impact that it did, but she was considered the new high priestess of feminism. And so I love this piece because it's a photograph, and it's a snapshot of this particular moment in history. So very different from an oil painting where someone has to sit for hours and hours. This is just that quick moment to document something that is happening. I see that someone is asking about the name of what she wrote. Her doctoral thesis was called Sexual Politics. So Kate Millett certainly was not alone during this movement. And this is, I keep saying that they're all my favorite pieces, but they really are. This is a portrait of Gloria Steinem and Dorothy Pitman Hughes. And so when you look at their pose and their posture, what does it make you think of?
Oh, and some great words popping into chat already. Martha says determination. Pam, defiance. Fiona adds victory. Karen says black power and now's power.
Mm-hmm.
Black power again here from Mike.
Exactly. And what Steinem and Hughes hoped to accomplish with this piece was really to signal their solidarity with the raised fist salute that was first popularized by members of the Black Power movement. Now, it really was Steinem that argued that inclusiveness across racial and economic boundaries was fundamental to the campaign for gender equality. And that is why she teamed up with Dorothy Pitman Hughes, who is a child care advocate. And what they did